Hi, today in this video I'm going to talk about analytical essay writing, sort of give you a bit of an introduction into what it means to write an analytical essay. This video is mostly aimed at high school students and maybe upper middle school students. I noticed that a lot of students of this age tend to have problems with jumping from persuasive essays to analytical essays, and that's an important jump worth exploring, and hopefully this video will help you out with that jump to make it a little bit easier. And I think it's important to, before we get into the mechanics of how to write an analytical essay, we look at why we do it in the first place, and that might help us on the journey to understanding what it is we have to do to get to that goal. But first, let's talk about what it is about persuasive essays that makes them easier to understand. I feel like a lot of students, especially on the younger end, tend to find persuasive essays. They find that they make sense intuitively. I think the reason for this is that persuasion is tied to a practical need to convince people to believe what you believe, or do what you want them to do using arguments and tactics. For instance, if you want your mom to buy you a puppy, right, you can list some reasons. That's a persuasive tactic. It's very commonly used in our everyday lives. On the other hand, analytical essays ask you to read a text sort of unnaturally, differently from the way that you'd read a text for fun. You're asked to look at the skeletal structure of a text and really go deep inside it. What I'm going to try and do is give a more intuitive approach to understanding what it is that analytical essays are trying to do before we get to how to writing one. So let's compare the two. Let's look at some similarities and differences between persuasive and analytical essays. The thing is, both of them have some kind of thesis, and both of these are making points, usually with sub-arguments that feed into the thesis. And of course, usually they're backed up by evidence. Now let's look at these two theses, these two types of thesis, and see what it is that they don't have in common. The first thing to look at is a persuasive essay very often tends to go like this. The thesis of a persuasive essay tends to be like this. Here is an argument or a belief or a declaration or statement, and here is why you should believe it, right? Here are some examples. Mac is better than PC because of A, B, and C. Or video games are a type of art because A, B, and C, right? We're pretty familiar with this kind of thesis statement. Now, analytical essays, they tend to focus on a text or texts, right? In this case, when I say text, I mean movies, plays, poems, speech, like any of those things. And they tend to, a thesis will tend to go something like this. Here is something that the text does, and here is what it makes us think or feel. Let me repeat that again, because that's really important. This is the key, right? Here is something that the text does, and here is what it makes us think or feel. Now, what the text does, we're going to call the device, and whatever it makes us think or feel, we're going to call the effect. Okay, now keep these two concepts in mind, because they're going to be very, very important going forward. The device and how it affects us, right? Device and effect, device effect. Now, here are some examples of this kind of thesis. The usage of repetition in this speech serves to A, B, and C. So in this case, the usage of repetition is a device. And then in the speech serving to do whatever it is, A, B, and C, that's where the effect would come in. Or friendship is a theme very often mentioned throughout this book. It shows up in A, B, C, and here is what the book wants to say about it. In this case, friendship being a theme, that's the device. And then what the book wants to say about it is the effect, right? It's what the book is really, really trying to tell us. Now, before I go on and break down we're going to look at the device side of it, and then try and understand some effects. But before I do that, I need to address a very, very common pitfall, which is analysis versus summary. And this is a mistake that a lot of students tend to make. And again, it's understandable. It is confusing the difference between analyzing and summarizing. Those two things are not the same thing, right? Analyzing is not summarizing a piece. Here's the difference. A summary is just a retelling or a paraphrasing of what we already know from reading the text, right? It's like here's what happened in the plot, or here's what the characters are, right? It's kind of related, but it's not quite what we're looking for when we're writing an analytical essay. Analysis tends to dig deeper. It's about telling us something that we can't immediately tell just by reading. It's more about how the author sets up and conveys their message and the effect that it has on the reader, right? In short, summary is more like what, and analysis is how. So let's look at an example, a pretty famous one that a lot of people know, Little Red Riding Hood, right? A type of summary, right, a question that would require you to summarize would be like, what happens in the story, right? Again, it's a what question. Now that's a boring question. It's like going to the grandma's house, the meeting the wolf, right? That's like the plot. Or like, who are the characters? In this case, the answer would be, Little Red Riding Hood, grandma, the wolf, etc. A rule of thumb is if you can look it up on Wikipedia, it's probably not a good analytical question, probably more of a summary question. Now, here's a possible analysis question. How is the story told? Now, that's an okay analytical question, but it is a how question that makes it better. So, for instance, you can say the fact that it's told through the eyes of the main character is what makes us more invested in the main character. Now, that's something more interesting, right? Investment and how we care about the main character is not something that we can already tell just by reading the story. Here's another interesting question. What is it that makes the story interesting? And in this case, we're getting into the deal of, for instance, there is repetition in the story, right? When the wolf says, the better to blank you with, better to hear you with, see you with. What that does is create a sense of build-up and anticipation and foreshadowing. Another interesting thing is that the main character is a small girl and the villain is a big scary wolf. What that does is it creates stakes and it creates an imbalance in who we think is stronger and scarier in the story, right? For a comparison, like imagine if Little Red Riding Hood was a big muscly bodybuilder and the villain was a pigeon. Obviously, it wouldn't have the same effect in the story. So these are all, now we're trying to tread deeper into more like analysis type questions because we're asking how the story is structured and what kind of an effect it has on the story. Okay, now speaking of how the story is structured, we're going to look at tools, right? So we were looking at literary devices. These are our tools of analysis. Keep in mind our very, very simple chart earlier, device and effect. So let's look at device. Before you learn to analyze, you kind of have to learn the language, right? Here's the thing. Most kids at this age, if you are the target audience, you probably already know a lot of literary devices. You might not know that's what they're called, but you know them. Everybody knows what a metaphor is or personification or repetition. These are all very, very common things that kids are taught, right? Because kids learn what they are and how to spot them, maybe how to write them, but maybe not in what ways they can be used or why they're used, right? They just know, okay, here's an instance of repetition without really telling you what the effect is or why do they use them, right? But here's a clue. The clue is in the name, device. Device, what is a device? It's like a tool used for something. It's like a means to an end. Like a hammer. For instance, there are guidelines we have for what a hammer can do, but there isn't really a rule book on how to use a hammer exactly correctly. You can use it to hammer a nail or pull out a nail, right, if you're using the back, or break glass, or, pass a sentence if you are using it like a gavel, right, if you're a judge. But what you use it for has a great effect on the result. But notice that there's so many different ways that you can use it. And these devices work in the same way, except instead of physically, they work in the text to varying different effects. To make this a little bit clearer, let's talk about an example device. Let's use metaphors, because metaphors are one of the most commonly used and commonly recognizable ones that a lot of people know. So what is a metaphor? Let's talk about that. So a metaphor is a comparison between two things without using the words like or as. Everyone will tell you that. Here's some examples, right? Drowning in misery. His eyes glowed red with rage. She was green with envy. Or it took a small army of doctors to cure him. These are all examples of metaphors, right? Now, how are they used, or why are metaphors used? A metaphor tells us things about the relationship between the two things we're comparing that are maybe either too complicated or multidimensional to have to sit there and explain. That is to say, saying that someone is miserable is not quite as striking, not quite as powerful, and doesn't quite tell us as much information as saying that somebody's drowning in misery, right? For an example, for a really, really good example, let's look at one of my favorite speeches, which is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, in which he talks about the plight of African Americans and the fact that they live on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. In this case, so, before we get to analyzing what it is that the metaphor adds to the story, why did Martin Luther King use the metaphor here? The best thing to do is to take away that metaphor, and we're going to create a boring sentence that is just going to factually explain what it is he just said, but without the metaphor. So we can say this: African Americans are poor, even though the country around them is very rich. Now, that sounds kind of dumb, right? But they're saying the same thing, essentially. Now, let's do a little bit of analysis here. What is missing? What is missing? What is something that the metaphor provides that this regular sentence does not? Well, one thing it does is that it creates a visual, right? It creates something for the mind to remember. The idea of being poor is hard to visualize in your mind as a picture, but living on a lonely island of poverty, that's so much easier to remember. What else? It emphasizes the scale. It emphasizes the scale, like a vast ocean. It's huge, it's massive, versus a lonely island. You're imagining this tiny little thing. What else? It makes us think about someone stranded on an island, right? Like a person is stranded and they're probably thirsty and there's all this water around them and yet they can't drink any of it, right? They're in this lonely island, and there's all this water, there's all this material prosperity around them, but they can't drink any of it. That's so frustrating and so ironic. I'm sure you can come up with more ways in which this metaphor is so much richer, right? The ideas, all of these ideas that I just listed, and I'm sure some more that you can list on your own, they all come from this one simple, beautiful phrase. And here's my point. By taking away that metaphor and just telling us the content of the sentence, we're taking away a big part of what makes the sentence compelling and effective, which means you remove the device, you remove the effect. All we have left is just a fact, instead of all the deeper meaning and emotion attached to the fact. And then that is why analytical essays are important. What they do is they let us dive deeper into a text, and bring out all the truths that the works are striving to get at, right? They let us appreciate the rich levels that were laid into a text to make it what it is. And overall, they make us better readers, because we can learn to tell if a text is good and why it's good, and what it has in common with all these other texts that are also good. In short, they're just as important as learning how to convince your parents that you need a puppy. I plan to continue this series if there's interest. We're going to get more into the nitty-gritty, into the technical of what it is you actually have to try and do when you're writing in one of these essays. But I think it was really, really important to begin by explaining why it is that we do this stuff in the first place, right? Why your teacher is forcing you to do this in class. Because, what it does is it bleeds into all these other things. So hopefully you had a good time, and see you next time.